Hello and welcome back to U.S. History with Mr. Snyder. Today we're going to be talking about manifest destiny in the 1800s in the United States. Here are your learning targets. We're going to talk about how and why Americans migrated westward in the mid-1800s. We're going to analyze the causes and the results of the Lone Star Republic's War for Independence, and we'll trace the effects of the Mexican-American War and the California Gold Rush on the United States. So just to recap what we've covered so far here in Chapter 2, we've talked about our states' rights versus our national authority. We've talked about sectionalism, or being loyal to your region, versus nationalism, being loyal to your country. We've talked about the Second Great Awakening and how those religious ideals have started to reform and shape society with the temperance movement and the abolition movement. We talked about the women's movement, and today we're going to be talking about expansionism. Expansionism is the expanding of the country. There is an expansionist mood in the United States in the 1830s and 40s. It was coined by the journalist John L. Sullivan. He's editor of the United States Magazine and Democratic Review. He charged that foreign governments who were conspiring to block the annexation of Texas in an attempt to thwart, quote, the fulfillment of our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions, end quote. And that quote isn't the important thing. It's to note that manifest destiny is the almost religious belief that the United States is destined to own all or most of North America. Expansionists want this area of New Mexico, Texas, and California. And so look at this. There's basically three parts to this manifest destiny. Number one is that God is on the side of American expansionism. And a second idea is that the spread of American rule means that we are extending the area for freedom. And the third premise is that this population growth requires that we take all of this land. If we're getting new people moving west and we are getting new immigrants coming into the United States, then we need new land to put all of these people. But however, this expansion comes at the expense of Indians, obviously, and of the Mexicans. In 1840 to 1860, about 240,000 people settle from the West Coast. They make the journey in wagon trains. They're usually left alone by the Indians, but not always. Sometimes Indians attacked, but sometimes they were also provoked as well. The Great Oregon Trail was the great overland route that brought these wagon trains of these American migrants to the West Coast during the 1830s and 40s. It extended for about 2,000 miles across the northern Great Plains and the mountains beyond. It crossed the Rockies and the South Pass and then forked into some other trails. The main northern route led to the Willamette Valley of Oregon. The alternative trails were open during the decade for overlanders, what they were called if they were traveling overland, heading for California. The journey from Missouri, where it started, to the West Coast took about 6 months. And within 2 years after 1843, 5,000 Americans were demanding the extension of American sovereignty over the Oregon country. Here you can see the this line actually up here is a line that was created between the British and America. We actually wanted this entire part of Canada, but basically said we will split Puget Sound here around the Seattle area, and that is where the line, 5440 line, we split it with Britain. So let's talk more about Texas independence. There are friction developing between the Mexican government and Anglo-American colonists over the status of slavery and the authority of the Catholic Church in Texas. At its core, this dispute centers on the unwillingness of these Anglo-American settlers to become Mexicans. So these American citizens are moving to Texas, which belongs to Mexico. It's a region of Mexico. and they remain Protestant, they don't learn Spanish, and they smuggle in their slaves when slavery is illegal. All people living in Texas had to become Mexican citizens and adopt the Roman Catholic faith, and slavery presents this other problem, and in Mexico, slavery was ended in 1829, and freedom was given to all slaves. Slaveholders in Texas were given a special exemption that allowed them to emancipate their slaves and then force them to sign lifelong contracts as indentured servants, but many refused to do this and limit their ownership rights. And they either converted to Catholicism only superficially or basically ignored this requirement. Well, in 1834, General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna made himself dictator of Mexico and abolished the federal system of government that they had. So in 1835, some of these Texans revolt against this new dictator and Mexico's central government. Santa Anna, a day later, then attacks the Alamo. After Texas declares itself independent of Mexico, Santa Anna attacks the Alamo, which is a former mission. Myths about this battle have magnified the Anglo rebels' valor at the Mexicans' expense, so it's really been blown out of proportion. Only 187 rebels there fought off a far larger number of Mexican soldiers for more than a week before eventually giving in. It's not true that all the rebels fought to the death, including Davy Crockett. Davy Crockett and 7 other survivors were captured and executed. But this gives the rallying cry, "Remember the Alamo," and it gives Texas a reason to fight. So Sam Houston is general for Texas, and he leads these Texan forces against various battles against Santa Anna and wins. And Santa Anna is forced to recognize Texas, and he signs a treaty recognizing Texas as its own country. So Texas is the only state in the Union that has been a state and its own country. Houston immediately wants annexation by the United States. He wants to become a state. And this doesn't happen for about 10 more years because the North doesn't want another slave state in the South, especially one as big as Texas. In its 10-year existence as the Lone Star Republic, Texas drew settlers from the United States at an accelerating rate, the population growing from 30,000 to 142,000. And the Panic of 1837 drove a lot of people to take advantage of land grants that were being given in Texas, offered to immigrants from the United States. And most of these newcomers assumed that Texas was going to be annexed by the United States soon anyway, and they would become American citizens once again. So at the same time that the United States was deciding the fate of the Oregon Territory, they were also disputing land with Mexico. Although the Mexicans had recognized Texas independence in 1845, they rejected the Lone Star Republic's claim to the unsettled territory between the Rio Grande River and Mexico. And the United States annexed Texas and then assumes its claim to the disputed area. Mexico breaks off diplomatic relations and prepared for war with America. And so on April 24th, 1,600 Mexican soldiers crossed the river and the next day met and attacked a small American group of soldiers, killing 11 and capturing the rest. After hearing of this incident, President Polk goes to war with Texas. And the Mexican-American War lasted much longer than was expected because the Mexicans refused to make peace despite us continually winning battle after battle. Congress did vote to go to this war, and Southerners and expansionists wanted to go to war because they want that land, and the North doesn't want the land to become annexed and become slave states. It does take about 2 years, but the U.S. wins very easily. We're a larger country, we're wealthier, we're more industrious to create supplies for war. And in February 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is signed. And what it does is it cedes New Mexico and California to the United States for $15 million. It establishes the Rio Grande as the new southern border of Texas, It also promises the U.S. government would assume the claims of American citizens against Mexico. And lastly, it provided that the Mexican residents of those new territories would become U.S. citizens and they wouldn't have to leave. So the people in the land in New Mexico and California become American citizens in those territories. So with that win, we gained 500,000 square miles of territory. It enlarged the size of the country about 20%, adding the current states of California, Utah, New Mexico, Nevada, Arizona, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. Soon, those interested in a southern route for a transcontinental railroad pressed for more territory along the southern border of that cession. And that leads to the 1853 Gadsden Purchase. And here you can see our country beginning to take form, with the areas annexed from Mexico in 1845, Texas becoming its own state in 1845. Here's what we won from Mexico in 1848. Here's this small strip of land down here, the Gadsden Purchase. And here is this light green is the Oregon country that we got from Britain in 1846, and we established this border here. So you can see our present country taking shape. Lastly, we have the California Gold Rush. And in 1848, workers see gold in a river in California, and the stories get exaggerated, and by the next year, 80,000 people migrate to California. And in the next 3 decades after that, perhaps as many as 500,000 people made this long journey over the Overland Trail heading west. And more often than not, it was men who decided to make the crossing, but a lot of them made the crossing with their families. Wives were consulted. In some cases, they really didn't have a choice because of women's social status during this time. But they could either go along or live at home. And many women regretted leaving these family and friends, but they agreed to the trip. And so California's population grows overnight. And it becomes 225,000 people in 5 years. And in 1849, California applies for statehood. And the balance right now is 15 free states and 15 slave states. And this is going to be a trend throughout Chapter 3. As we add states, we don't want to add free states without adding slave states, because that would give one side more representation than the other. And so that will be a continuing trend going on to our next section of U.S. history. But thank you for joining me today, and I will see you in class.